Good evening. Like Jack said, if you can fill out those surveys, if there's any topics on autism that you're interested in, I'm scheduling right now for our October series. So I do look at that to see what everybody's interested in so that we can get some more speakers out. I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. I am very lucky to know Crystal. She is the clinical director at ConnectPlus, which is a wonderful company. She has an expertise in special education and ABA. She's one of the first BCaBAs in the nation. And she's been a BCaBA, which is an assistant behavior analyst, for 22 years, and she's right now completing her BCBA coursework to get her BCBA. She actually ran a company here until 2009 when she moved to Nova Scotia, and founded a not-for-profit special education private school, is that right? And she also did equine therapy. And then she came back here in August of 2016 and started Plus. So I will leave the rest of it to Crystal.
Thank you, Renee. Appreciate that. So I want to start by asking who I have in front of me. How many of you are parents or family members of an individual on the autism spectrum? Okay, great. How many of you are professionals that work with individuals? Okay, so it's about half and half. That's wonderful. This talk is really geared towards parents, I will say that, but it's written in a way that as a professional, you can take this information and turnkey it with your families that you work with. So kind of frame it in that way when you're listening to the information. So as Renee said, I'm considered an assistant level behavior analyst. I've been in the field for 25 years, and over the time that I've been in the field, I happen to be married to a man in the military, and so every 3 years we were moving to some new adventurous place, and every time we would move, I would go to wherever school district or agency and say, give me the thing that nobody else wants to do, because then you get work really quick. So I have had a lot of varied experiences over the years. I've worked with children as young as 12 months through adults in their 20s and 30s. As a teacher, I'm also a special education teacher, as Renee said. So I've seen it from the perspective of being a teacher in a classroom, but I've also worked in homes since the beginning of my career. And I really feel strongly that professionals and families, I love seeing us all together, because the only way that this, consultation and support that we give is going to work is if we're truly partners. So that is what we strive to do at ConnectPlus, and I appreciate all of you being here tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about what I'm characterizing, and I'm trying to create a different language around two different things, tantrums versus what I call meltdowns. And I've seen some things out in social media that I'll show you that have led me to use that terminology. So our agenda for tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about tantrums, meltdowns, what my definitions are for them. I'm going to review what we call the functions of behavior. How many of you have heard of that before, functions of behavior? Awesome, good. And we're going to discuss what we call antecedent interventions. What are some things that we can do before we are leading to escalating behavior? And then lastly, we're going to discuss how to talk through supportive behaviors. For those of you who are familiar with applied behavior analysis, I think historically our field has been seen as the professionals who tend to put behavior on extinction. That term sound familiar to some of you? Okay. Or use planned ignoring. And we're just going to ignore that behavior, and that's where the term extinguish comes from. We're going to ignore it until we kind of it puts the fire out itself, if you will. And I think, for those of us who are more progressive behavior analysts, what we call radical behavior analysts, we understand there are emotions and feelings, and yes, maybe these are private thoughts and we can't necessarily take tally counts on it because we don't know what people are thinking, but we do need to take this into consideration when we develop intervention. So I'll be talking a lot about that tonight. So this is one of the things that I was referring to from social media. This is borrowed from Autism Daddy Blogspot. Anybody know Autism Daddy? Yeah, he's actually fairly local. You can see him sometimes at Autism New Jersey. He comes to the conferences. So I really loved his explanation. I'm going to use that tonight. So we look at the idea of a tantrum, and in my field, we call it goal-directed behavior. This is a behavior that there's a want. There's a desire that's very clear to that person, and they are engaging in that behavior specifically to get a particular outcome. So a child may engage in behavior because they know that you're going to stop what you're doing and attend to them. How many of you have children or nieces or nephews what happens when you get on the phone? Now, somehow, my dogs do it. I am not kidding. Whenever I do a Zoom, Renee used to do Zooms with me. Whenever I do a Zoom, I think it's because they think like no one's here. She must be talking to us. But they just get all up and want something from me. So again, just an example of a behavior that kids engage in because there's some kind of outcome they're looking for. A lot of times you'll notice if a child is having what we think of as more of a tantrum is they'll do a check-in. So you'll have a kid who's wailing. I don't want to do it in the mic. I'm usually really good at that. So they're screaming, ah! Right? So they know. And I also refer to this sometimes as the light switch behavior. They can turn it on and turn it off, the waterworks. There's all kinds of analogies for this. So it's something that they're checking on your engagement. They're making sure that their performance for their audience is going to result in that outcome. And usually these tantrum type behaviors will resolve once the outcome is obtained. Okay? So that you can see in development. It's developmentally typical for any child, even outside of what we're talking about in terms of autism, to engage in these behaviors between the age of 1 to 5 years of age. Now, I have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old. I actually thought about modifying that number. My daughter is getting a almost 20-year-old Toyota Sienna minivan for her first car. We're having some tantrums. All right. Now, that we're going to kind of put in juxtaposition to what we call an autism meltdown. And a meltdown is a result of an individual being overstressed or overstimulated. So it is a more biologically driven behavior. It is a reactive mechanism to something that's going on in that environment. There's something happening and they're reacting to it. It will continue without your attention, and it will continue without an audience. In this case, children who are engaging in meltdowns will get to the point where they're not even concerned for their own safety. And that's another clue to me sometimes when I'm trying to determine what type of behavior is this, is if I have a child who is engaging in an escalation and they go to, kind of bang their head, and they bang their head and then they go, oh, wait a minute, I didn't mean to do it that hard. Have you ever seen that? Anyone? Okay. So whereas the child who is truly escalated, that will engage in head-banging behavior where you need to protect them or they are going to hurt themselves. It can come out of fatigue, and it is not goal-dependent. It might start out of a goal-directed behavior, but ultimately once a child is escalated, even if you provide whatever it was that was the original desire, it's not going to shut that behavior off. okay? So in this case, I love the very last line that Autism Daddy gives us. An individual in this condition may require assistance to gain control. And that's where we have to understand the difference, because if that individual, and I say individual because I truly believe this is true of our very young babies all the way through our adults on the spectrum in their 20s, my experiences through 30s, I have seen the need for that same compassion and care and support all the way through adulthood. So you'll hear me say individual a lot as opposed to child, okay? And that assistance is coming in the way of providing regulatory and calming techniques that that individual is not yet able to do for themselves, all right? So the beginnings of understanding how to tease this out, I think really that's the hardest part, is when you're facing a behavior, trying to decide, is this goal-directed? Was it goal-directed, but now it's escalated to a point in which this individual can't calm down? You know, where are we in this escalation? And how do I respond in the best way that this isn't going to happen again in the future? And that's that idea of reinforcement, okay? I refer to setting events as things that get the kettle boiling. How many of you suffer from being hangry? I was that on my way here today. I stopped at home. I take my dog to work, and so I went home and dropped him off, got my daughter to work, got the dog fed, you know how we juggle. And my husband comes home, and of course he wants to chat. And I'm like, I gotta get to Camden County College, and I don't know where I'm going. Of course, I was 45 minutes early, but that's beside the point. And I just was like, I can't talk to you right now. And on the way, I saw Dunkin' Donuts, and I was like, oh. And I went through the drive-thru. I got the Power Breakfast sandwich. It's really good. I highly recommend it. And I ate that sandwich, and all of a sudden I was like, I need to call my husband. And I did. So I want to show you a little clip, and some of you may remember this commercial from a while back.
Can we turn the AC up? I'm dying back here.
It's on. Can't you feel it?
Can you feel that?
Eat a Snickers, please.
Why?
Every time you get hungry, you turn into a diva. Just eat it so we can all coexist
Turn
in
into
here.
a diva.
Put it in your system, cranky pants.
Okay.
Thank you.
Better?
Better.
Will you get your knees out of the back of my seat?
So when these different, and there were different ones that came out. Let me figure out how to close this.
So you guys grew up together?
Yeah, since 3rd grade.
There were a series of these, and they were quite funny. And it was really a perfect example of that idea of a setting event that is influencing behavior. We say that it kind of changes the value of reinforcement around you, for a more technical definition. And let me see if I can figure out how to minimize. There we go. All right, so does everyone know generally about Maslow's hierarchy of needs? A little bit? Okay. So there was a very famous psychologist, Maslow, and he put into a beautiful chart what is really, I hope, common sense, that human beings need to have their most basic needs met in order to actually learn and grow. And our basic needs, physical things, warmth, nurturing, comfort, and all of that. So I really think about that hierarchy of need when I'm talking about setting events. We need all of those needs met before we can really look at higher level learning. And all of the things that can impact that include everyday kind of natural routines and occurrences. So sleep, eating, and definitely among our population of kids and adults, we see a lot of medications. And I would say that in terms of medications, it's often not even the medication that's the problem, it is the management of the delivery of the medication. So I would, as a teacher and as a mom, how many of you had the pink amoxicillin bottle for your kid? How many of you have forgotten to give the pink amoxicillin bottle to your kid? So having consistent delivery of medications is challenging. Life is hard. Getting everything into a day is difficult. So we have the medications, we have the side effects, and we have the consistent delivery of those medications. And that can really cause fluctuations in someone's behavior and ability to cope with things around them. Sleep in particular with the autistic population is very, very challenging. Many of the individuals that I work with have some kind of sleep disturbance. Either they have difficulty falling asleep at night, or they wake up multiple times in the night, which means that mom and dad are waking up multiple times in the night. Many of our kids in particular only need about 4 hours of sleep. A little theory about that is that the child goes through 1 or 2 cycles of REM, and we all go through this, where you actually go through a cycle of REM, and it can be anywhere from an hour and a half to 4 hours in length that you cycle through and go into a very deep sleep, and then you cycle out and you just barely, almost like twilight awake. And the rest, most of us, when we're in that kind of twilight zone, we fade back into that deep sleep. And for our individuals with autism, they go through that REM cycle, get into that slightly awake zone, and they cannot go back to sleep. So that is a situation in which, in our field, we talk about doing sleep hygiene. I think it's always funny, these terms that we come up with. So we do sleep hygiene, and we teach parents to read their favorite bedtime book, take a warm bath, use all of the great aromatherapy that we have now, do massages and things like that. But all of the great sleep hygiene in the world isn't necessarily going to be able to combat a biologically based rhythm in this kid's body. So it's hard. So, and then of course, any kind of illness going on. I know this winter in particular, I feel like I say this every winter, so I don't know if it's really true or if it's just my perception, but this was such a bad winter. I mean, we had kids that were having high fevers for like 4 and 5 days straight and going to the hospital for dehydration. It was a really tough winter. And of course, I run an agency with approximately 70 individuals that go out into homes and work with primarily kids in their homes. And so they were all getting sick. So it's been a really challenging season this year. So all of these things kind of set the stage for how a kid is going to be able, and I'll say kid in this particular example, how a kid is going to be able to handle a situation that they find stressful. And we have to think about these setting events, even though they're not always under our control. As a teacher, I would have children come into my classroom, and I could tell they hadn't slept. And I knew their situation, that they probably had not had a big, decent breakfast, those kinds of things. And I could give them a snack. I could let them rest their head on their desk. I could do a number of things to try to help. But just being thoughtful and aware of it, sometimes the best part about that is that it just gives you room for compassion, so that you're not looking at the behavior and thinking about the behavior in a way in which you feel that it is at you. I've had, in doing years of consultation with teachers, I will have teachers say, "Oh, he just does that to make me mad." Very rarely is that ever truly the case. It really, because I do my research, I take my data, and ultimately in the end, I don't go back to them and say, "Yeah, he was just trying to make you mad." That's not usually what I come back with. So I think thinking about these setting events gives you that space to take some of the taking it personal and the emotion and all this, taking it out of the equation so that you can actually be supportive and provide the strategies that are going to get that child where they need to be emotionally and physically. So I'll stop for a second and just take a moment if there are any questions, or if there's anything that's resonating with you that you want to say, you know, I'm from the South, so amen, hallelujah. Is there anything anybody wants to ask or share? Yes?
With the family, and the child was pretty severely impaired.
Okay.
He was verbal and everything, but what the mother stated to me was, and I don't know if this is like a full diagnosis or something, but
Yeah.
she stated that he has periods of mania.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And I sure will. Absolutely. So the young lady in the back is asking, she had a family that she worked with, and the mother explained that, about her child, that the child was having periods of mania. And I assume the child was also autistic? No? Okay.
No, I mean, he is autistic.
Yes. Yes. But there can be both. There can be both. And yeah, so, and I've actually been a part, I'm not a diagnostician. I am a master's in special ed. I have this certification for behavior. So I do work with clinical psychologists, pediatric neurologists, developmental pediatricians, MDs. I have worked in the past with them to collect data to establish whether a child has, in addition to their autism, a diagnosis of a mental health disorder or mental illness. And I have seen a number of children over the years who did ultimately receive a comorbid diagnosis of bipolar disorder. That is not unusual. What is unusual are the behaviors that a child presents as a child with bipolar. It's not what you would think it is. It's different than the way an adult with bipolar disorder presents. I also teach at Rowan University. I'm a professor there, adjunct. I pop in and out of there. I've been there for about 12 years. Sometimes I get like a second wind, and I'm like, yeah, I want to teach a class. And then I do 2 semesters. I'm like, oh my God, I'm not doing that ever again. But I do, when I'm teaching, I tend to like to teach developmental psychopathology. And that course explains and talks about how mental illness can present differently in a child. And then imagine adding another layer to that of autism spectrum disorder. So it's interesting. It's very, very interesting. And I've been able to help get some kids data that we could take to the proper doctor to receive a diagnosis if appropriate, and then to be medicated appropriately for that disorder. So that's definitely a thing.
So you're saying that you suspect there was a dual diagnosis?
There could be.
Because mother didn't present it that way. Mother was very educated. She's an engineer. She gave up her career, to take care of the homeschool.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Yes, and she just stated to me that, well, some people with autism have manic episodes, and my son does. But I was thinking, he had a dual diagnosis, but so you're saying some students with autism do have manic episodes?
I would tease out the fact that autism spectrum disorder per the DSM-5 does not have any criteria related to mania. So no, I would say if that was presented, that could possibly be a comorbid diagnosis. Yeah, but it's not part of the DSM. To just quickly break it down for you, I call the DSM diagnosis for ASD as like a Chinese menu. It's like a little bit of brown rice, and I'll have some chicken and some sweet and sour, and I'll have this from here, and that's why we end up with this spectrum, and all of our kids look so different, on this spectrum, which is probably why I've been in this for 25 years, because I never get bored. I meet the most fascinating, wonderful, individuals on the spectrum, because it is such a unique, you're pulling from so many different things. So, good question. Yeah.
Can you kind of break it down what you mean by comorbid?
Sure. Break it down what I mean by comorbid. Comorbid means that it's 2 disorders that are happening at the same time. And there can be some interconnection between them. And you can imagine for an individual with autism that autism itself includes behaviors that probably are under the category of anxiety, probably fall a little bit under the category of obsessive compulsive disorder. So it gets tricky. And honestly, the DSM was created by a bunch of, at the time when it was very first created, this isn't true as much now, when it was first created, it was a bunch of very educated white men who sat in a room and discussed what they thought all of these disorders, looked like and how they would describe them. And over the years, this is why we're on our 5th version. And if you look at versions over the years, you'll see how things really changed and evolved over the different versions, and ASD is completely different than when I first started in the field 25 years ago in terms of how we define it. So autism is a set of behaviors that we look for, and we look for clusters of certain behaviors. So you can't just have one, particular characteristic. You can't have just two. You need to have at least, I don't have it memorized, but it's like 2 from the first category, 3 from the second, 2 from the third, that kind of thing. So, and we often say, like, if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism, because every individual is so different. Does that help answer? Okay, great. All right, so setting events, we've got that down. So goal-directed behaviors. Applied behavior, the field of applied behavior analysis really looks at how does environment impact behavior. And the way that behavior analysts look at problem behavior is that we can change what happens before and we can change what happens after. But we're not actually changing behavior. The change in behavior is completely up to that individual and how they respond to their environment. So we spend a lot of time looking at every little detail of what was going on prior and everything that happened in terms of the interactions, especially with people, after the behavior occurred. So I'm going to throw out to you, let me know, just kind of, I reinforce calling out behavior. So call out to me, what are some things you want to get in life? A job? Food, yes, you're my friend. A lot of money. Love. Over here I heard something. Relationships, yes, perfect. What are some, and can we all agree that those are all those things? I'd like to have all those things. Especially after doing my taxes, I'd really like the money thing right now. All right, what are some things that we want to avoid in life? Stress. Say again? Pain, illness, bills, taxes. Awesome. So can we all agree, pretty much collectively, those are all things we want to avoid. So in life, there are things that we find enjoyable and give us a warm, fuzzy feeling inside, and then there are things that are aversive, and we want to avoid or escape those, at whatever cost. Okay, so this is where we get this idea of function, and function is asking the question, why are you doing that? Why do I get up every morning and drag my behind to the gym and do the treadmill, and today was 200 sit-ups, and I have a fitness coach. Why do you think I do that? By the way, I don't like it. So why do I do that? To feel better. I want to have flexibility. I own a horse. Say again? Oh, I just said strength. Yeah, strength, absolutely, So for us as adults, we can have delays in our reinforcement. generally my trainer is very positive, and he gives me lots and lots of reinforcement when I'm there, and I pay him a lot of money to do that, but he does a really good job. So we all are doing behavior for some kind of outcome. And as human beings, all of these things I think we can agree on are things that we behave for. We behave for certain kinds of attention. And in our adult lives, attention is in the form of relationships and love. And that is what gives us those warm and fuzzies. Status, part of status, I think, for us as adults, we characterize as respect. And, people understanding that we have something to share, something we know. Access to activities and material goods, our hobbies, and the things we enjoy doing if we happen to have some downtime. Yeah. Sensory stimulation. So we, in the behavioral world, we call that automatic reinforcement. So if you were in a room by yourself, you would still do this behavior because it's just something about it. And for me, that's singing. I am very automatically reinforced by belting out tunes, and I tend to only do it in the car or in the shower now. But don't worry, I'm not going to break out into song. But that's what does it for me. So, and then lastly, there's been discussion out there about this idea of that we are reinforced by feeling in control of our environment. So other things that I think we would agree upon that we all avoid, certain tasks. Somehow, I am a good behavior analyst because somehow in the last 22 years, I managed to shape up my husband doing all of the laundry. Don't tell him that's unusual if you meet him. Just be like, yeah, all husbands do all the laundry. Yeah. Okay. Boredom. That's definitely an aversive for me. I'm always having to fidget, do something, read something, listen to something, stimulation. Avoiding certain kinds of people. When we're forced into situations as adults, this is usually our work environment. When you're walking down the hallway and you see someone turn a corner and you're like, I think I need to go to the vending machine. So we all, I think, can agree. Sometimes there isn't that connection, or maybe there's a rub. Failure. We all want to be successful and do good at the things that we attempt to do. So we will try to avoid that. And lastly, the feeling of embarrassment. So in addition to all of us agreeing that these are universally things that we try to get and avoid, I would challenge you to think through each of these. Are individuals with autism, they want the same thing. It's really no different. It may look different in how our kids with autism behave to get these things, but they want the same things. So as you look down this list, if you have a family member or if you work with someone, can you envision them wanting these things on this list? You can just nod or shake your head no. I hope we all can agree, like, this is being human. So knowing that, how do we tease out when something is a behavior that's a tantrum, and when is something a behavior that is truly a meltdown, biologically based escalation out of their control? And we also want to keep in mind those setting events that could be impacting what direction that behavior is going to go. So for the goal-directed behaviors, there are some things that we can do ahead of time. And as I said before, we like to refer to these as antecedent interventions. And when we do an analysis of behavior, we'll often collect data to see what was the antecedent, what happened before a particular behavior, usually a behavior of concern. We describe that behavior very clearly. And then we look at what happened after, which we refer to as the consequence. But I want to be clear about the meaning of the word consequence. I feel like in our society, the word consequence has started to take on kind of a negative connotation. So if you hear, oh, he's going to get a consequence for that, you know, and we assume that's bad. That's something that's going to be bad. But consequences can also be very good. You know, an example, if I engage in, I'm trying to think of something my boss really wants from me, and it's usually reports and things that I don't like to do. So if I get him all of the reports for the week, and he says, here, take you and your clinical supervisors out to lunch on the credit card. That's never happened, but it'd be a really good one. Then that's a consequence. It is. It's a consequence. He said, here, take the credit card, go to lunch. So it just follows behavior. And we want to look at those patterns without making judgment initially. We just want to look and see what keeps on happening again and again and again. So in schools, we tend to have, especially in the middle school and high school, we have kind of more of a demerit type system. So if you engage in a behavior, there's a set kind of consequence for those behaviors, and it's not related to the individual. It's not thinking about the function of why they're engaging in the behavior. It's just, you do this, and this is what happens. And so I know many children that I've worked with that they figure out really quickly, if I curse at this math teacher, I'm going to get sent to the office. The principal's going to be busy, so I'm going to hang around for 45 minutes waiting. I'm going to sit through, for those of you who remember Snoopy and the teacher. Okay, that's fine, I can deal with that, because that is less aversive than having to be in a math class where you do not know what's going on around you, you can't perform the tasks that are being given to you, and you're feeling like a failure and you're embarrassed. So things that we perceive as consequences that we think are punishers can sometimes be acting as reinforcers. So in that case, sending that child to the principal's office is a reinforcer for that child to be cussing at the teacher. And they're going to be more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. And that's what a reinforcer is. Something that follows a behavior that increases the likelihood that they're going to do that behavior again. And then a punisher would be the reverse, something that follows the behavior that decreases the likelihood of that behavior happening again in the future. So understanding that is part of knowing what to do about goal-directed behavior. Yes?
I teach first grade, and I hear what you're saying, but when you have 27 first graders, and you have 3 that are possibly on a spectrum.
Yep.
They haven't been officially diagnosed that way.
Yes.
We know that there's other things going on. You have a 504.
And regardless, with the world of inclusion, they're going to end up back in your room anyway. Yeah.
I'm trying to not send them out the room.
Yes.
The room is small, 27 people. I tried to do the avoiding it. I'm not avoiding it.
Ignoring it.
Like I was told to do.
Not the answer.
Don't feed into it.
Yeah, I know. Can I explain to you why that's probably, yeah, good for you, by the way. I just did a talk on burnout at our professional conference, by the way, so good for you for taking a mental health day. I will tell you why that's probably not going to work. Yes. So repeating the question, she's a teacher in a first grade class, 27 students. She's got 3 that are likely on the autism spectrum, not yet diagnosed, and they're engaging in a lot of behavior. And it's not the behavior that she's looking for, right? How did I do? Okay, good.
I don't want to keep
Yes.
having this student removed
Yes.
from the classroom, so I try to
Yes.
balance it in the class. My
Yes.
colleague will switch off, and
Yes.
I send him to her room to
Okay.
to read a story to the class.
Gotcha.
But I'm told I need to write everything up, write them up, write them
I
up,
know,
write them up.
I know.
And I'm not a write-up teacher.
Yeah, I
So
know.
I'm like,
Well, let me tell you why planned ignoring is likely not going to work. And I'll give you my email and you can give it to the person that told you that. I'm happy to defend my position. Is that when you use planned ignoring, which is this whole idea of extinguishing a behavior by not attending, that means that every single person in that environment also has to be able to put that behavior on extinction. So if any of your other first grade peers attend to that behavior in a way that kid likes, they're reinforcing. So regardless of how much you ignore, it's not going to matter. I worked in a school once, and I had a kid who was engaging in behavior, and I went into the hallway and stayed with them and kept them safe, but did not attend to them whatsoever. No eye contact, no really engaging or interacting. I was in a setting where I felt like I could do planned ignoring and be successful, so I was implementing it. And the principal comes down the hall. And sure enough, why are you out in this hallway, young man? What do you, and I'm just like, really? I looked at my watch, I'm like, you just reinforced 25 minutes of extinction. So if you have saboteurs in your midst, then that's not gonna work. And it's true. And it's not that extinction doesn't work. Extinction works beautifully. I can show you tons of literature that would put you to sleep. If you have any trouble sleeping, come see me. I got lots of journal articles for you. I could give you lots of literature that would tell you that, yes, that will work. But in the environment that you're in, it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to execute it in a way that's going to be successful, and then you're going to be frustrated and taking a mental health day. So I will give you some things here that I think will help. And since you two do support each other, there are some things that I think you could do, and I'd be happy to talk to you more. Okay? Yeah. All right, so let's talk about what can we do. If we know that it is a goal-directed behavior, that it's looking for one of those gets or avoids, we want to initially, before anything ever happens, make our expectations very, very clear. So I'm going to give you a story to help illustrate this idea. I have a colleague, Dr. Megan Miller. She presented with me at APBA on burnout. She's amazing. And she has a 2.5 going on 3-year-old little boy, and they are in the process of getting him to sleep in his own bed. And at night, my colleague, she does a lot of consultation and Zoom meetings in the evening because we work with people in different parts of the country and overseas. And so her husband has been in charge of bedtime. And her husband is of the mindset, which we've all done it. I'm not calling him out, where I told him it's bedtime. I'm done. We're not messing around anymore. I'm not playing into this anymore. I'm just going to tell him no. And she's having her meeting, and she can hear the ruckus going on, And the little boy was asking for a glass of milk. And he said, no, I told you it's bedtime, it's done. And Megan had to go to him and say, remember, we've set up expectations with our son. We've told him, you can call to us twice. If it's something related to either having to, potty or have a drink, those are basic biological needs. We're going to meet those needs. You and I, if I need to go pee in the middle of the night, I know what I do. I get up and go pee. Right? A lot of times lately, actually. And if I'm thirsty, I get up and I go get a drink. But we have this issue with small children about compliance. I don't like the word compliance. And, no, I've said it, and so they're going to do it because I said it. Instead of setting up some clear expectations and making them realistic and doable, and then sticking to it. So Megan's, I don't know how she put the people on hold, but she's like, hold on. And she went and gave him a cup of milk, and he asked for something else, a toy or something. And she said, remember, you can ask for this, you can ask for that, but not a toy. And he was fine because it had been made very clear in the past. He tried, of course. and he was asleep in 2 minutes. So that's where this talk is addressing exactly what you're talking about, that sometimes it's not so black and white, and we need to attend to the function of the behavior. If the function of the behavior is attention, which the person that's consulting with you has probably identified that, anybody who is really wanting of attention is never going to be less wanting of attention. Do you have a coworker who you would say engages in attention-seeking behavior? Yes. I'm that person in my office, in case you couldn't tell. I'm just really blatant about it. I'm like, I'm soliciting for attention right now. Can you stop what you're doing? So anybody who has attention-seeking behavior, they're not going to have a less desire for attention-seeking behavior. So we have to teach them what behavior to engage in to get access to attention, and we have to shape up for them to be able to handle a delay in getting that access. And that takes time, and it takes some planning, and it takes a lot of reinforcement, and it takes a lot of setting up these clear expectations. So with a kid with autism, this is no different. I know I'm talking in very general terms tonight. This is all kids, and it applies to our kids with autism too. Okay? So if we have expectations that are very clear, repeated often, and not in a threatening way, in an educative way. So, before things happen, I have almost 100 employees in my employ. And when I have an employee who goes against a policy or engages in an undesirable behavior, my first question is, what have I not done in terms of communicating what's expected and setting up some kind of contingency where they can access reinforcement? And I usually call them in and we sit down and have a nice talk. Most people in my company aren't afraid if I call them and say, hey, I need to talk to you. The ones that have gotten to know me know I'm just going to learn something. And when I leave, I'm going to have more information than when I came. So some other ways we can think about doing this is also keeping in mind that not all individuals learn things the same way. I and my daughter and my grandmother, we all have dyslexia. And so I am not textual. Please don't give me something to read. Do not give me an IKEA piece of furniture to put together. Because if it ain't intuitive, you're going to get what was supposed to be a shelf is going to be a desk. So I am very good, though, with visuals. I love charts and color coding, and you should see the beautiful charts that I make for my work. Today we had a meeting, a leadership meeting for my BCaBAs, and we were doing something, and I go, I'm gonna make a chart for that. And everybody was like, oh God, here we go. So I respond to visuals. Some people, my daughter, thank goodness, she somehow is auditory. She's able to learn by listening, which I have a harder time with. And so that serves her very, very well with her dyslexia. So as we're thinking about individuals with autism, I want to give you the caveat, just because it's an individual with autism also doesn't necessarily mean that visuals are the way you're going to reach that person. It's probably a pretty high probability. Our kids with autism do tend to respond to visual information better than auditory information. But what I'll tell you is more important is that our kids with autism, they typically react and respond to their environment with one sense at a time. So if you can get a child with autism to engage with you auditorily, maybe it's through music. So if do you use a song to transition? Yes. Oh yeah, of course you do. Good job. So you might be able to get that child to clue in that music means something and take it as a prompt or a cue or whatever and be able to behave the way they need to. But if you do that, you might not necessarily want or expect them to also interpret something visually at the same time. Or if you give them something very visual, especially something really colorful and stimulating, you might not want to pair that with a lot of verbal directions at the same time. So, and again, when I say these things about people with autism, I'm making huge generalizations, and you have to know that. Every individual is different. I'll say it 100 more times before we leave each other tonight. But generally, one sense at a time. If I'm asking an individual with autism to do something kinesthetically, stand in a line and be able to know where they are in space, not step on all the little hands and toys in the play area while they're walking through, then I'm not going to talk to them or expect them to look at anything. I'm going to give them tactile cues to help guide them, because then they're clued into their kinesthetic, and that proprioception is there, and I'm not going to do the other things that I could do to help them along. Yes?
I was going to say, I'm a special education teacher for the K through 5 younger grades.
Okay.
I do have a student that's on the spectrum diagnosed, and he works really well with social stories.
Okay, all right.
Because I do find that when I'm trying to like talk to him, you know, he's like, oh,
Yeah.
you know, but the
Yeah.
social story that I just give to him, he'll read it.
Cool, and that's textual, right? Yeah. I will say a little something, Renee, you know where I'm going, right? So I will throw in there, as a behavior analyst, there are social stories, which is Carol Gray is the author and designer of an intervention called Social Stories. And then there is the use of social narrative paired with behavioral skills training. So if you're going to use some kind of written story, and they're wonderful, I use them all the time. Yeah, but if you're going to use a story, and I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a child who is going to be going, actually we have a kid who was going for testing where you have to put all the electrodes on. I forget what that one's called. Thank you, EKG. And so we spent weeks preparing him. He also had to have an ultrasound too. So we took a Wii remote and we wrapped it in plastic and put goop on it, and we pretended like that was the ultrasound wand. So we did all this practice and, you know, really worked on it, and we created a social narrative that went along with that. But we didn't simply just give him a story and, you know, social stories, Carol Gray's idea is that you read the same story or have the individual, if they're able to, read it to themselves multiple times across days, weeks, whatever. And that in doing that, it's almost like a watered down cognitive behavior therapy, that you're changing your private events, your private thoughts. There's some truth to that. There's some level of, you know, something that comes out of that. It's not very robust. So you need to pair that with behavioral skills training, which is giving that instruction, and that social narrative is part of giving that those directions. And then you need to model it, and then they need to practice it in a safe place, and then they have to get feedback whether or not they're doing it. And then you go back and you revisit practice. So anyone who's using what you call social stories, I really urge you to look into pairing that with behavioral skills training, and you'll just get a lot more bang for your buck. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really great. Training, BST, behavioral skills training. When you plug that in Google, Google is going to go, whoa! There's lots on there. Yeah. All right, so the last thing on this slide that I want to say is the use of warnings. My theory about warnings is that basically what you're saying to, let's say, to a child is, you did that thing that you know you're not supposed to do, and I'm telling you can do it 2 more times till I'm really going to do anything about it. Right? The only time warnings are helpful is if you're working with a kid who has something like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Then you're talking about a kid who truly has a neurologically based kind of leaning towards impulsivity. And impulsivity is something that cannot necessarily be controlled all the time. So if I have a kid with ADHD engaging in behaviors, I will use sometimes some level of a warning system but then I want them to engage in the different strategies we've worked on for focusing and attending and not continuing that behavior. But besides our population of kids with ADHD, warnings are simply saying, yeah, I gave you the expectations, but I'm not going to give you any consequence this time, so you do it 2 more times and then we'll get there. And you're wasting their time and your time, and you're really going to confuse them. The other thing about warnings is that we have this idea of what we call schedules of reinforcement. So if you reinforce a kid every single time, so let's say that if you raise your hand, and I say, hi, what's your name? Julie. Okay, so every time she raises her hand, I call on her, and so that would be continuous reinforcement. Every time Julie raises her hand, I respond to her with a smile, and hopefully it's reinforcing. And so she's going to keep doing that, and I'm going to keep reinforcing that every time she does it. So the other type of reinforcement is variable reinforcement. How many of you have been to Atlantic City? Okay. So if you think about going to Atlantic City with your big, huge bucket of quarters, and you keep putting those quarters in, and you keep putting them in, and you haven't won a nickel, but you keep putting them in. And then suddenly the person 3 seats down from you gets the big, loud clang, and the money starts pouring out. And you can't put those quarters in fast enough, right? And that's that idea of variable reinforcement. So you don't know when reinforcement's going to come, so you keep behaving, waiting for it to happen. That is actually a stronger schedule of reinforcement than continuous reinforcement. So if I give warnings and they're getting access, you're variably reinforcing behavior. Does that make sense? Confusing to the kid. So think about that when you think about warnings. Yes?
Can you just clarify something?
Sure.
Is a warning different than giving them a choice?
Yes, very different. She asked, is a warning different than giving a choice? Absolutely.
Okay,
Choice
that's my
is...
version of a warning.
Okay.
You can either, if you continue this behavior, I'm going to, it's like we were in a dollar store.
Okay.
I said I'm going to start putting stuff back.
That's different. That's response cost.
Right. Okay.
You're giving a threat of response cost.
Okay.
That's not a choice. It is a choice and it isn't. Choice to me as an intervention is, I'm going to offer 2 things that you want, and you get to pick one. That is using choice to empower and to more likely to reinforce that child. What you're doing is you're giving a threat of taking something away. Yes, to some degree, but typically what we find with punishment, and this is like going back to the boring literature, and I could probably pull up another article that could help you sleep tonight, where they say that punishment really starts to become linked to you and linked to the dollar store and to that situation. And it, for whatever reason, scientifically, it doesn't generalize. Whereas if I teach you a skill, you'll take that with you to the grocery store with grandma and in the classroom with the teacher. So it's just the way of human behavior that punishment tends to be signaled by that person in that environment and that situation. And so if I were to say, if you do that again, I'm going to put stuff back on the shelf, they know about that situation.
Or you can calm down, keep a calm voice, and you keep your things.
But you've already, in that way, you've already allowed them to escalate to a certain level where you can give them tools where they never got there to begin with.
I don't know. I mean, we've been trying for years. She's 25.
I want to help you.
Part of it,
Yeah.
part of it was that I didn't let her know what I wanted from her. And I usually do.
Ding,
and I
ding,
didn't
ding.
this time. So
Yeah.
I thought about that whenever I
Yeah.
thought about
And
it.
that's there you go.
Yeah.
ding, 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 you got it. And the thing that gets really frustrating in working, because I have a young man I work with, and I've worked with this family since he was 6 years old. He's 21 this year. And he has an issue when he sees people with their arms folded. He used to have a teacher who, whenever he would engage in undesirable behavior, the teacher would say, oh, and then a punisher would usually follow. So he started to, that just became a thing. And he's got a lot of anxiety and obsessive compulsive behavior and all kinds of stuff going on. So now when he sees people out in public with their arms folded, he will bum rush them and make them unfold their arms. And he's a big guy. And we developed a program to teach him, to prime him before we went into an environment, to let him know what the behavior was that we expected from him during that time frame, and then what good things would come. And we came up with a time frame that was reasonable for him to be able to really hold it together. And we figured that out through the hard way, And so we did that, and he was doing amazing. He would see folded arms, and he would engage in, we gave him kind of a script of what he could say to try to self-calm, all these things. He would earn access to all kinds of great stuff. It was like Oprah, you get an iPad, you get all those things. And then time went by, and Mom and Dad, who I love dearly, she's one of my best friends, she stopped reading the narrative. And a couple months after they just kind of stopped doing this intervention with him, he really had a blowout in Target a couple weeks ago. And we had to sit down with the family and say, and that's what's hard, I think, is that the young lady you're describing is 25, you've been dealing with this for how long you said, and at some point, is it ever just gonna go away, It's not normal for her to do that. Okay, anymore. Okay. When she was younger, she was more behavioral. Sure. Difficulty-wise, it was just all behavioral. And I'm going to say that day when she had that issue, and you got to a space where everybody was comfortable, and you're like in maintenance, we say, and you're like, she's got this, we got this, we can go to the dollar store. And then she had a rough day, and she did those things, and she needed this again, but there was probably some kind of setting event that you don't even know. You don't even know what it was, and that's what's so hard about working with these individuals I work with, is that there's always a reason, and I don't always get to find out what it was, because, this young man I work with, he can't really articulate to me why. I've learned, because I've known him for so long, I know the holidays, and there's certain things that are just that I know are gonna get him going, and we have certain cycles we see. So it's those setting events. But this kind of stuff, when you have that situation, throw this back in for a little while, and then you get things going again. And remember, it's always got to end in access to reinforcement too. So you can set up all the expectations in the world, but if there's no payoff at the end of the day, and for me, let me tell you, I love my job. I love my job. I work with Renee can tell you, I work with the most wonderful group of people you could ever meet. But if Mr. Eagle decides to stop paying me, I'm probably not gonna go back. I'm gonna go to the barn. So we all have expectations, but at some point, you've gotta come in contact with reinforcement. Now, sometimes that reinforcement can be scaled back to something really simple, like giving her a squeeze because you love her, and maybe she likes that, but you gotta reinforce with what works. I say, sometimes I want the individuals I work with, if they only had a sign, like the guy on the side of the road, will work for, and it says, will work for, and that would be great, especially for the people I work with who love variety in their life, and the things that they love and that they find reinforcing change every other day, which, hey, that's their prerogative. So, does that help a little bit? I mean, it doesn't mean that you're wrong, it just...
Reward that behavior, because I see parents do that all the time in stores.
I agree,
So
and...
I guess I'm trying to figure out, how do I help her distinguish that I'm not rewarding your bad behavior, I'm trying to...
In a situation like that, where it came out of the blue, I would just leave. I honestly would just leave, because at that point, it's like, okay, we've got a problem here. We need to just reset. Like this whole thing we were trying to do here, it's not going to happen right now, because we've got to go back to this. What's that?
Isn't that punishment?
Think about.
Looking forward to going to the dollar store. She had her gift card. It was the first time she was going to use one.
Yeah, it's probably, yeah. There's nothing wrong with punishment, though. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with punishment. It's the idea that in that moment, you're not teaching. So I'm not making her leave with the intent of punishment. Maybe it'll be perceived as such, and hey, great for me, because next time we come, maybe things will go better. But you're doing it not with the intent of punishment. You're removing the environment that was evoking these behaviors so that you can go and do this work again and try again and have her be successful. And I don't even think the response cost is a bad thing. Let me clarify. Like, you better believe that I tell my own kids, you better knock it off or you're going to give me that phone, So I do response cost. It's in your toolbox. But if you want to make behavior change that's going to last, then you're better off doing this next time. That's all. You can do response cost. But I just don't want to see anybody fall into the trap of thinking that, oh, response cost, that's what I'm going to do every time. No, you can do it that time to get through it, but then you got to get back to this part. Nothing wrong with it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So that was just, because I was so used to her doing better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not like I'll be punishing her all the time, or that's our go-to. But
Don't worry, I'm not calling DIFUS.
I just felt like that was the only thing that came to mind at the time. It's like,
Exactly.
you got your goodies.
And it worked, right? It worked. So you safely got out of there without a fuss and without everybody staring at you and being mean, and yeah. Nice, excellent. And that's great. And I think that was a great strategy, because you didn't tell me that it wasn't a regular behavior until after I responded to you initially. So once you told me that, I think it's perfect what you did. But now do this again for a little while. Yeah, that's all. Yeah, good stuff. I saw a hand over here.
I think removal is a very effective intervention.
It can be, but you're going to get side effect behaviors sometimes.
After 10 minutes becomes a reward, but removing a child and just letting them sit.
Oh, removing the child, yes. And we're going to talk about that.
Leaving the dollar store without being mean-spirited is like, we have to go.
Yeah, it depends.
These things will be
I think what she did worked for her, though. She knows her. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a counselor too.
Yeah, exactly.
I teach parents how to.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not my specialty like you.
Okay.
But I just felt like if I tried to remove her from the store,
You'd have worse.
she would have a meltdown.
There you go. Yeah, and then it really would be a meltdown, not goal-directed. Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to make it worse either.
Yeah, it sounds like you did the perfect thing in the moment, and then now you can get back to teaching again, get her back to where you know she can be. Awesome. All right. So here's the things that you just gave to my group here, so thank you. So the key, number one, try not to raise your voice. And if you're that mad, take a break. One of the great things about human behavior and what we know about behavior analysis is if we do things every once in a while that accidentally reinforce behavior, it's not the end of the world. That's normal, that's life. We don't live in a laboratory. And so please don't beat yourself up. If you do have a moment in which you do things that are just probably, and you're like, oh, that was the worst thing I could have done. That's okay. Especially with kids. Kids are super resilient. I remember my daughter, when she was 13, we had just moved back from Canada. And I don't even remember what it was over, but I got so mad at her, I decided I was going to spank her. I don't think I'd spanked her since she was 2, like on the butt, on the pamper, when she did something that was going to hurt herself, safety-wise. I'm not a big spanking person, but boy, I had it in my mind that girl was getting a swat, and I chased her all over the house, and I couldn't catch her. And then I just started laughing, and we started laughing, and, it was funny. So anyway, in the future, if I were to feel like that, I would want to take a break. Take a break. As long as the child is safe, and they can't hurt themselves, take a break. You know, I worked with so many parents. I remember when Oprah first came out as a show, and I think Ellen would probably be my suggestion now. It's a little more nowadays, but like, you know, go turn on Oprah for 10 minutes. Just take a moment, and that's okay. That's okay, especially for those of you in the audience who are parents. You know, us as professionals, we can do this from, 7 to 3, 9 to 5, whatever. And then we get to do a reset button. Parents don't typically get to do that. So you have to make it happen for yourself. And that, I talked all about burnout and self-care for the last 3 days, so it's on my mind. Once everyone is calm, if you have a child who can engage in verbal behavior and can talk and explain, listen. Make sure you have all the details of a situation before you act. And think about it, we want to try to do that ABC analysis, and that means really understanding what was going on before the behavior happened. So sometimes if you have a child who's verbal, you can listen and get some information. I will use the count to 3 approach. There's a book, The Magic of 1, 2, 3. I'm looking at counselor and social worker. Do you guys know it? You guys go find it. Okay. Yeah, then that's not the book. But the magic of 1, 2, 3 is the idea that you're going to give that child an opportunity to really take in what you're asking of them, process what's been asked, give them time. But when you do 1, 2, 3, if I say to this gentleman, okay, tie your shoe. Okay, I've asked you to tie your shoe. I'm already walking to 1, 2, before I even get to 3, I'm already over and I'm ready to do help. I'm ready to help because you treat it as, behaviors don't happen for one of 2 reasons. It's either there's a skill deficit, he doesn't know how to tie his shoe. So I'm gonna come over, I'm gonna help and I'm gonna support. Or the second, there's no motivation around tying that shoe. So I need to think about, how do I get him to care about tying his shoes? Or maybe I just go buy Velcro. So like those are the 2 questions there.
I think it's called 1, 2, 3 magic.
Oh, 1, 2, 3 magic? Dyslexia, there you go. Yeah, no, good, thank you. So that 1, 2, 3 approach, the other thing, as I said about that, is giving the individual time to process. And especially individuals with autism, and listening and hearing you and taking it in, giving that time. So when you use 1, 2, 3, it shouldn't be this really scary, like threatening thing. It should be tie your shoes. 1, 2, tie your shoes. 3, I'm going to help you. So it's not a scary thing. But it is cute. And for those individuals who are doing it because they're not doing it because they're not motivated, if you show enough times, you're going to tie your shoe. You start walking towards them and like, oh, all right. And they tie their shoe. So yes.